Wyoming Territory, spring of 1883. The wind howled low across the high plains near the Elk River, rattling the dry bones of last year's grass. Josie Fairlight stepped down from the eastbound freight wagon with a single worn satchel and a face the color of chalk. Her dress hung off her like it belonged to someone else, and the man driving the wagon barely spared her a glance as he turned the oxen back toward Rawlins. She had nowhere left. Behind her was Kansas, a past she would rather torch than face again. Ahead only the land and whatever work she could find. The town of Elk Hollow was barely more than a stretch of false front shops and a chapel that held services every other Sunday. Folks stared as she walked through the main street. Some looks were curious, others pitying. A few cruel. "She is too skinny," a woman muttered behind her palm. Josie heard it. She straightened her back and kept walking. The general store was her first stop. She used the last of her coins to buy a stale biscuit and a tin cup of spring water. She was sucking the dry edges of the bread when the bell above the door rang, and in walked the man who would change everything. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat and a thick scar that cut down from his left eye to the corner of his jaw. He moved like a man used to pain. Franklin Eaves, the storekeeper, greeted him. Josie looked up. Their eyes met. She looked away too fast. Franklin did not. Outside, she sat on the porch rail watching the dust roll in from the north. Her stomach ached. She had eaten for the first time in 2 days, but it was not enough. "You looking for work?" She turned. Franklin stood there, arms crossed, his voice low and even. "Yes," she said. "I have a place 10 miles west. My ranch hand ran off midwinter. It is mostly fencing, tending to cattle, some cleaning. It is hard work. I can do it." He looked her over. Not with judgment, but calculation. "You have a name?" "Josie Fairlight." "All right, Miss Fairlight. I ride out at first light. If you are not afraid of the cold, you can ride with me. I will be here." He nodded once. Then he turned and walked away. That night, she slept in the hayloft behind the livery. The stable hand let her, seeing her bones and the way her hands shook from hunger. Morning came cold and bright. She was already waiting when Franklin rode in. He had brought a second horse. She climbed into the saddle like someone who had not done it in years but still remembered how. They rode in silence. His land stretched far miles of open grass, a few hundred cattle, a low house built of stone and timber. A barn stood behind it, the roof patched in places. "I will show you around," he said. She worked hard. Harder than he expected. When her hands blistered from the wire fence, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. When the wind cut through her like a blade, she did not complain. He watched her. Quiet, steady. By the third day, he brought her inside for supper. "It is too cold to eat outside," he said simply. She sat across from him, spooning stew into her mouth with shaking hands. "You have people?" he asked. "Not anymore," she said. He did not push. The days turned warmer. The calves were born. They worked side by side, and she began to smile against small things, but there. Then the storm came. A late blizzard rolled in from the mountains, sudden and brutal. Franklin was out checking the herd. Josie saw the clouds and knew he would not make it back in time. She saddled his mare and rode out into the white. She found him with a broken leg, half buried in snow beneath a fallen branch. "You should have stayed," he gritted. "And let you die out here," she snapped. She hauled him up. She was smaller by half, but she got him on the horse. She walked them both back through the storm, dragging one hand behind her to feel the fence line. Back at the house, she splinted his leg, wrapped it tight, and sat by the stove all night, feeding the fire and watching him breathe. When he woke, he stared at her. "You saved my life." She looked down. "You gave me work. That is more than anyone else ever did." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "Josie." Her name sounded different in his voice. She swallowed. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I am worth something." "You are." She stood too fast. Her chair scraped the floor. "You do not know me." "I know enough." She left then, but not far. She sat outside on the porch, the wind cutting low and cold. He called for her the next morning. "Come here." She did. He took her hand. "People said things about me too," he said. "After the war. After the scar. They would not look me in the eye." She blinked at him. I see strength in you, Josie. Not weakness. She looked away. You are too skinny, they say. But I see bones that carry fire. She laughed once, raw and real. That is a damn strange compliment. He smiled. It is the best kind. She leaned in, and he kissed her. Soft. Careful. Like he knew what it felt like to be broken. That night, she slept inside in the spare room. But when the house creaked in the wind, he knocked on her door. Just sit with me, he said. She did. He did not touch her again. Not yet. But she fell asleep with her head on his shoulder. And when the sun rose, everything was different. Because for the first time in years, Josie Fairlight felt like she was home. Franklin's crutch thumped against the floorboards as he moved through the doorway, slow but steady. Josie was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the fire up from its embers. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows and her hair was pulled back with a strip of frayed muslin. She didn't look up when he entered, only tilted her head slightly to the side. You're walking better, she said. He eased himself into the chair by the stove. Getting there. Bones still mending, but it holds. Josie turned to face him, brushing soot onto her apron as she stood. You ought to let it rest more. If I sit too long, I start thinking too much. She nodded once, then crossed the room to the shelf where she'd lined up the last of the dried beans and a twist of salt pork. She spoke without turning. Thinking's only bad if you're trying not to feel something. Franklin watched her hands as they moved, measured. Sure. What do you think I'm trying not to feel? Guilt, she said, quiet. He didn't answer right away. The wind outside had softened, and only the creak of the beams above filled the space between them. Finally he said, I dragged men through worse than this. Some didn't come back. That has a way of sticking to you. Josie set the knife down and leaned her palms on the counter. You were a soldier. I was a boy with a rifle, he said. Same as most. She turned then, arms crossed, her weight shifted to one hip. You ever think about leaving all this behind? The land, the work. Starting clean somewhere else. Franklin rubbed the side of his jaw, the scar pale against his weathered skin. You ever try to outrun what's in your chest? He looked at her then, his gaze level. It follows. Josie didn't reply. She walked to the window instead, her reflection faint in the wavering glass. The plains stretched out beyond, still brittle from winter, but greener near the streambed. I saw a hawk this morning, she said, circling above the ravine, looking for something to carry off. Maybe. She folded her arms. But it didn't dive. Just watched. He shifted in his seat. You get used to the quiet out here? I like it. You'd say if you didn't? She turned, leaned against the sill. I don't lie about what I need. Not anymore. Franklin studied her. The set of her mouth was different than when she arrived, firmer, but not hard. She met his eyes now without flinching. He could see the difference, though she never named it. Come spring, he said after a moment, I'll need help driving cattle to the trader near Sweetwater. I can ride. It's 5 days both ways. Nights get cold still. I've slept colder. He gave a short nod. Then you'll come. She watched him, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. You trust me to stay, even after your leg heals? I never asked you to stay, he said evenly. No, she agreed. But you didn't ask me to leave either. He stood then, slower than he liked, but on his own. He crossed the room and picked up the tin kettle she'd left by the stove. You make this coffee? She raised an eyebrow. Why, you planning to be polite now and compliment me? He poured 2 cups and offered her one. Only if it's worth drinking. She took it, sipped. Could use more grounds. He looked over the rim of his cup. So could most things. That night the sky cleared. Josie stood on the porch, arms tucked against her chest, watching the stars come out one by one. Franklin joined her, his steps uneven but firm. He didn't speak, just stood beside her. The silence felt full, not hollow. After a while, she asked, You ever think about what's next? For the ranch. For you. He looked out over the west pasture. Used to think I'd finish my days here. Just me and the land. And now? He turned his head toward her. Now I think that sounds lonely. She didn't answer. But she didn't move away either. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Neither of them said anything more. The wind had gone still, and the only sound was the creak of the porch boards under their feet. By late April, the calves were fattening on new grass, and the last of the snow had melted from the north-facing slopes. Josie patched the final tear in the barn's roof, crouched high among the rafters, her dress pinned at the knees and a strip of leather wrapped tight around her palm to keep the hammer from slipping. When she climbed down, Franklin was waiting beside the ladder, holding a basin of water warmed by the sun. "You missed supper," he said, offering it to her. "I wasn't hungry yet." She dipped her hands in, scooped water to her neck, and scrubbed off the grit. "Roof's done. I figured, seeing as you're still alive." She dried her hands on the hem of her skirt. "You doubted me? I watched the wind try to toss you off twice. Didn't take." He studied her a long moment. "You ever think about building something of your own? I don't have land. Land can be shared." Josie leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed loosely. "That a proposal?" "No," he said, quiet. "Just a question." She didn't answer at once. A swallow dropped low from the eaves, then darted back up into the rafters. "I thought about it once," she said finally. "Before my brother lost the farm and traded my name to pay his debts." Franklin didn't flinch, but his jaw set. "He give you away?" "Near enough. Left me with a man who drank more than he worked. I left when I found the knife under the bed." His fingers curled around the edge of the basin. "You carry it now?" "I buried it in Arkansas." He let out a breath through his nose. "That's the kind of thing a man should know about a woman he's thinking of building with." Josie met his eyes. "You think we're building something?" "I think it's growing, whether we planned it or not." She looked past him, toward the sloping ridge where the cattle grazed. "You ever been married?" "No, why not? Didn't want to tie someone to a past I can't rewrite." "You think I want a clean slate?" "I think you deserve it." Josie stepped closer, her chin lifted. "I don't want clean. I want honest. I want something that doesn't vanish when things get hard." Franklin didn't move. "I can give you that." She reached up, touched the side of his face, not the scar, but the opposite cheek where the skin was sun-worn and warm. "Then say it." He caught her wrist gently. "I want you beside me, Josie. Not as a hand. Not as a guest. As mine." Her voice was steady. "That's not something you say once and forget." "I don't forget the things I mean." She didn't pull away. "Then ask me again when you're ready to make room in your bed." He nodded once. "You'll know when I do." The next morning, they rode out to check the western boundary. Josie carried the rifle slung across her back, not because they expected trouble, but because she liked the weight of it there. They found a section of fence knocked flat by elk, and while Franklin limped along the line to assess the damage, Josie set to digging a new post hole. "You ever think about children?" Franklin asked, his voice carrying over the scrape of her spade. She paused, bracing on the handle. "Sometimes. Never seemed like a thing I could have." "You still can." She glanced over her shoulder. "You want them. I want what comes of a life built right. If that's children, I'll raise them. If not, I'll still have you." Josie didn't smile, but her hands moved quicker after that, and when the fence was mended and the sun dipped low behind the hills, she didn't ride ahead of him. She rode beside. That evening, she lit the lamp in the front room without being asked, then laid out his supper where he could reach it from his chair. He watched her quietly, his eyes following her movements like they steadied him. When she sat, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. "I've got nothing to offer but this land, my name, and the way I'll treat you." She looked down at their joined hands, her thumb brushing the edge of his calloused knuckle. "Then I'll take your name," she said, "and I'll give you the rest." He kissed her hand, not quick, not shy. When she rose to clear the dishes, he stood as well, even though it pained him. She didn't stop him. They moved together, quietly, with no need to speak. Later, when he opened the door to his room and looked back, she was already there, waiting. They didn't rush. They undressed each other like it was something sacred, something earned. And when they lay down, it wasn't to erase what had come before, it was to begin something that could last the rest of their days. The morning sun cast long bars of light through the kitchen windows as Josie stood at the table, slicing cornmeal into a shallow pan. Her movements were unrushed, but there was purpose in them. Something had settled in her since the night she and Franklin had crossed from quiet trust into something fuller. She didn't name it aloud, but she carried it in the steadiness of her hands and the way she turned her face toward him when he entered the room. Franklin leaned against the doorframe, still bracing some of his weight on the cane he'd carved from a stripped-down juniper limb. The wood had warped slightly, but he liked the feel of it under his palm. More than that, he liked the way Josie looked when she worked without hesitation, her body moving like it belonged to this place now. "I passed the North Trough this morning," he said. "Water levels dropped." She didn't glance up. "I'll ride out after breakfast. Could be the pipes clogged again." "Take the bay. She handles better near the creek." Josie wiped her hands on a rag and finally looked at him. "You think I don't already know that?" He tipped his head. "Just checking if you're still listening to me." A small sound escaped her, half-breath, half-laugh. "I listen. I just don't always wait for permission." He stepped into the room, slow but steady. "You think I'd want it any other way?" She poured the batter smooth, slid the pan into the iron oven, and shut the door with the heel of her hand. "You might not want it, but most men expect it." Franklin drew out the chair nearest the stove. "And Saturday, I'm not most men." Josie crossed her arms. "You sure about that?" He looked up at her, and something in his gaze softened. "You've been here long enough to know what I am. What I'm not." She didn't answer right away. Then she pulled out the chair opposite his. "And Saturday, you're steady. Even when you're angry, you don't shake apart. I've had enough years to learn how to carry it." Josie's fingers toyed with the hem of the tablecloth. "I've never been with a man who could hold his own silence." Franklin leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You don't need to be filled up with noise to be seen." Josie blinked. "Once? No one ever put it that plain. I've only just started saying what I mean." A quiet passed between them, not empty, but full of something growing roots. He broke it gently. "You ever think about keeping bees?" That startled her. She looked up, brow furrowed. "Bees? There's a wild hive in the cottonwoods past the West Ridge. I figure if we box it right, we could draw it back to the house. Sell the honey come fall." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You want to start a hive?" "I want to build things that last." "You said you didn't want easy." "Neither do I. Bees don't give sweet without sting." Josie stood, slow, her fingers resting on the table edge. "You ever been stung?" "Plenty. Still think it's worth it." She didn't smile, but her voice lost its edge. "We'd need cedar planks. And a veil. I can fashion something decent from the old window mesh." Josie nodded once. "Then we'll do it." He watched her walk to the stove and check the bread. She moved with an ease that hadn't been there weeks ago. Not comfort exactly. Something deeper, like she'd begun to believe the ground wouldn't give way beneath her. Later that morning, she rode out alone. The sun was high by the time she reached the trough. The pipe was knotted with dry grass and a rabbit carcass, likely dragged in by a fox. She cleared it, washed her hands in the stream, and sat for a moment in the shade of a cottonwood. From her saddlebag, she pulled a small folded cloth, Franklin's old bandana, and unwrapped the cornbread she'd packed in it. She ate slowly, watching the water ripple past, and thought about what it meant to live a life not defined by escape. She had never stayed anywhere more than a season since Kansas. This land, its roughness, its honesty had become a kind of mirror. And Franklin, with his quiet steadiness and scarred face, had become something she hadn't dared hope for. Not a rescuer. A partner. When she returned, the sun was dipping low and the light touched the fields in gold. Franklin was in the shed, sorting through scrapwood. She dismounted, tied the mare, and walked to him. "I found the hive," she said without preamble. He looked up. "Still active?" "Full of bees. We'll need to move fast if we want them settled before summer." He nodded, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You sure about this?" She stepped closer. "I'm sure about a lot of things." He didn't reach for her, just looked at her like he could already see 10 years down the road. "You remember that night you pulled me out of the snow?" he asked. Josie's voice was quiet. "I remember everything about that night. I'd never known what it meant to be chosen. Not until then." She didn't answer, just stepped in and rested her head against his chest. He held her there, one hand on her back, the other pressed to the nape of her neck. The evening air cooled and the crickets began to sing. They stood like that until the last of the light faded and the day gave way to something new. The bee box sat beneath the slope of the north-facing hill, tucked close to a stand of chokecherry and shaded till noon. Josie had stained the wood with boiled walnut husks so it wouldn't warp in the heat, and Franklin had hammered the joinery himself, slow and precise. They'd settled the hive just after first bloom when the wildflowers along the Elk River began to open wide. Josie stood watching the bees work, her hands on her hips, her dress gathered at the waist with a strip of canvas. The veil hung loose around her shoulders. Franklin came up behind her, carrying a small tin pail of water and a folded cloth. "You see the queen?" he asked. "She's in there. Took to the frame soon as I said it. You were right about the cedar." He passed her the cloth and she wiped the sweat from her neck. "You're better at this than I thought," he said. Josie turned, holding his gaze. "You keep saying things like that. Like you're still surprised I can do what I said I'd do." "I'm not surprised," Franklin said. "I'm still learning how to expect good things." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked with him back toward the house, boots crunching over dry grass, the light behind them long and golden. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into rhythm. The cattle fed heavy in the southern pasture, and the fence lines held through the high winds. Josie took to keeping a ledger, tracking feed stores and supply orders, her handwriting precise, her columns neat. Franklin had traded 2 hides for a second-hand stovetop oven which Josie used to bake sour biscuits and sweetbread, her shoulders relaxing little by little as her days filled not just with labor but with proof of what they were building. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of rose and honey, Franklin brought in a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. He set it on the kitchen table, tugged the knot loose, and pulled back the fabric to reveal a polished iron skillet and a set of hand-carved spoons. "What's this?" Josie asked. "These were my mother's. I found them in the storage crate behind the grain sacks. Thought maybe you'd want to use them." Josie looked at him, her face unreadable at first. Then she reached out and traced the worn edge of the skillet. "She liked to cook?" she asked. She was quiet, but she kept the house warm. Josie folded the cloth back over the pieces. "Then I'll use them." Franklin stepped closer, his voice low. "You keep this place warmer than she ever could." Josie looked up at him, her eyes soft. "I don't know if I ever thought I'd be someone who made a house feel like home." "You are." She reached for his hand, their fingers weaving together like they'd always known how. That night, they ate on the porch. The moon rose behind the ridge, and the night air held the scent of wild mint and sage. Franklin poured her a tin cup of cooled coffee, and she passed him a slice of bread still warm from the oven. No words passed between them for a long while, and none were needed. Sometime after the stars came out, Josie turned to him, her voice quiet. "You ever think about putting up another room?" He glanced over. "You planning on needing one?" She nodded. "I reckon we might. Come winter, I'll be showing." He set down his cup without a sound. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." He leaned forward, both hands on his knees, his face unreadable in the dark. "You afraid?" he asked. "A little. But not enough to wish it different." He turned to her fully then, his voice rough. "You've given me more than I ever hoped for. You and this child," she reached for him, touched his cheek. "We're yours, Franklin." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "And I'm yours." The next morning, they hitched the wagon and rode into Elk Hollow. Franklin traded 2 cured hides and a sack of beeswax for lumber and a pane of window glass. Josie found a bolt of soft cotton muslin and 3 small buttons carved from bone. That evening, Franklin started framing the new room, and Josie measured the floor with a length of twine, her palm resting often on the slight curve of her stomach. Weeks passed and the days grew shorter. The bees settled into their rhythm and the honey harvest filled 2 stone jars. Josie began sewing in the evenings, her stitches even, her fingers calmer than they'd ever been. Franklin sanded the cradle he'd built from pine, his thumb tracing each joint to be sure it would hold. One night, as the first frost etched the windows, Josie stood in the doorway of their room watching him stretch a quilt over the new bed frame. "Do you remember when I first showed up?" she asked. "I remember how you looked at the ground like it might swallow you." Josie stepped into the room, her voice low. "I never thought I'd be safe again." "Not really." Franklin set the quilt down and crossed to her. "You are now. You always will be." She rested her head against his chest, her arms around his waist. "I don't need much," she whispered. "You have everything I have." By winter's peak, the house stood strong against the wind. The baby came just after the thaw, a girl with Franklin's quiet eyes and Josie's dark hair. They named her Clara after no one in particular, just a name that felt like sunlight. Josie held her by the fire, and Franklin sat close, his hand cradling the back of the baby's head. "She looks steady," he said. "She will be," Josie answered. "She'll grow up knowing what it means to be loved." Franklin pressed a kiss to Josie's temple. "Because of you." Josie met his eyes. "Because of us." Outside, the wind had gone soft and the land lay still beneath the stars. Inside, the fire burned low and their daughter slept between them. They had no need for promises. They'd already built a life that would hold.